We're going to get started on this panel where the program's running a little bit behind schedule, but I'm pleased to welcome you for this session. My name is Beth Barron. We'll get straight to our presenters. We have 3 presentations this early afternoon on the panel on Islamic Feminism, Contemporary Frameworks. So I'll introduce the speakers right before their papers. The first paper will be presented by Beverly Dawn Metcalf, but it's also co-authored with Charlotte Karam. So just to give a little background, introduce both these authors. Beverly Dawn Metcalf is an associate professor in international management and development at AUB. Her research interests focus on women's empowerment in the Arab Middle East. Charlotte Karam is an associate professor of organizational behavior and associate dean of programs at the School of Business, American University of Beirut, and her interest broadly examines responsible engagement of organizations and its employees in developing economies. So we'll get started. Each speaker will be speaking for 15 minutes, 3 speakers, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Okay. Can everybody hear me, or do I need to use the mic? Use the mic, okay. Thanks. Yeah, it's probably useful to highlight some of my background. I've spent quite a lot of my time in a business school in the early stages, and then I was in the Global Development Institute, or what is now called the Institute for Development Policy and Management, which is in the University of Manchester. So my background has been very much in international development, focusing on the Middle East, and my colleague Charlotte has got a particular interest in women's empowerment in the Middle East as well. I want us to position this argument within broader ideas of feminist futures, feminist realities, feminist materialities. And I think it's important to highlight that feminism has always been contested. It's always been challenged. If we remember those wonderful writings by Adrienne Rich, when she talks about the travelling theory in her classic Of Woman Born. But Valentine Moghadam says that in every group, in every place, every time, the meaning of feminism is worked on in the course of being and doing. So by feminists and activist scholars, we are part of that imaginary, both in action and also thinking as well. I think we need to also think about transnational feminisms and their influence, and the post-feminist dialogue that is happening all around the world, and that is, a really important area that I do think Islamic feminism should be connected to. My approach to Islamic feminism is very much positive. I'm pro it, and I think it is an important avenue to support social and economic change. I'll just briefly highlight this, but if we think a lot of the writings that have dominated in Middle East women's studies have highlighted, to discuss equality and Islam is an oxymoron. They just cannot be connected. And this was highlighted in Menisi's classic text, which she wrote in 1975, but then her follow-up text really started the process of what I call reimagining and rewriting dominant Islamisms that were underwritten from a masculinist perspective. And Islamic feminism is a contested dimension. And within the broader international development literature, the idea of Islam has been associated with underdevelopment or less than, and women not being able to exercise agency and rights, and because they are oppressed by Islam, but also by the patriarchal cultures that explain Islamic social practices and ideology. But then we've also got the other dimension that, broadly, when we're looking at the relationship between the global south and the global north, you know, the idea of feminism initially was seen as a colonial or a Western project. So there's this contestation that has, you know, nicely been used, is being an ongoing discourse. And so how can women in the Middle East articulate an agency, articulate a feminism, and resist dominant global North interpretations, and actually, you know, have as part of their text and their life elements that are relevant to them, which may also include religious identity. So Islamic feminism, I think, is an alternative space. It provides opportunities for presence. It definitely can challenge dominant masculinist cultural practices and dominant masculine ideologies. And as part of this process, we are kicking back at the idea that Middle East women are less developed, they're not able to exercise empowerment, but we need to get them to be part of the script of moving forward social change and equality. But also, maybe we should be incorporating the commitment of those who were religious and faithful. So this is what I am interested in, this is what Charlotte's interested in. We are very much supportive of social change, and the paper that we have written is all about how we can feminise change. And what I mean feminising change, I don't want to adopt a biological essentialist approach. I want us to use the feminine as a textual strategy to untangle oneself from masculinism. Now this is a very, very textual tactic to unstable and decolonise dominant masculinist interpretations. And this is the reason I really loved Jocelyn's point when she says we need to begin with a contestation of the body. And I think inherent in Islamic feminism, that contestation of rights is very much, if you like, it's about writing through the body and becoming aware of how the feminine or the signifier woman can be placed in a disadvantaged arena and perceived as less than. But Islamic feminism, I think we need to be positive about. Why? Well, because global capitalism hasn't advanced the rights of women globally, but neither has the liberalising project of feminist Islam achieved rights and inequality. So both at once, we've got to tackle the duality of these texts that are shaping this. Because when we think about how feminism has been crafted in other states in the global north, it's often adopted an individualist stance, and it's associated, even now, which is part of the post-feminist debate with the neoliberal logics. But Islamic philosophy is very different because there is a great emphasis on the collective and of the importance of being the individual, being able to participate in the community and work with the community. So there's much more of a social ethos within Islamic philosophy than within rights-based approaches which focus on an individual dimension, individual identity. So I want to use the term feminising fiqh as a textual strategy to destabilise masculinist interpretations, and put women as scholars, as activists, as lawyers, as legal executives to play a role in recrafting what the different Islamic texts say about women's role and equality, and basically getting women involved, using the feminine role deliberately, using Judith Butler's phrase. We are interpreting religion for themselves, and we're challenging men and masculinity, and we're invoking an egalitarian ethic. So here are some of the areas that we can see feminising fika in reality when we think about the Kolo, Moroccan family code, the Indonesian family code, the fika process in Nigeria recently. This is an interesting case where women were acquitted of adultery in a court, and this did involve the overhaul, a new precedent for how women could act out and resist sexual harassment, but also get agreement for the right to divorce. So the Ijtihad is all about the process of legitimising and empowering a feminine ethic. Some of the things that we do need to think about, though, there are concerns and tensions when we're thinking to articulate how do we go ahead with Islamic feminism. Can we associate it as a national state feminism? Is it a new strategy that could be adopted by state policy? Because it is associated with territorial locations, but I think that's inhibiting and delimiting. We probably need to think about that. And it's important to think about the idea of state feminism is also not exact, because at the one hand, in some states, for example, in Saudi or Oman, state feminism is legitimised by giving acknowledgement and support and money to women's organisations who can do Islamic feminism. Whereas in other regions, you may have women's organisations that are doing empowerment issues, but not necessarily under the name of Islamic feminism. So we need to think about multiple state feminisms, because some of those are liberating and some of them are stifling. Because we do need to rethink how we can address public selves, private selves, public opportunities, private opportunities, all about negotiate and navigating different feminine and feminized identities. Because, the marginal identities, the marginalization, we should appreciate it isn't, we cannot say there is one Islamic feminist identity. We need to be thinking of multiple. And of course, the other thing that is important to future Islamic feminist debates is the importance of social media and how that stimulated reform. And how it has, garnered support and revolutionary tactics and fervour. So definitely that's got to be part of the agenda. But I do want to think that Islamic feminism can be radical, despite that it is co-opted by some states and some senior political leaders, because it does offer a voice, it offers a direction, and hopefully it can result in new associations and new ideas for how Islamic feminism can be given legitimacy. And what is also important, we need to link it to broader Islamic economic development. Islamic economic development is a new development model that is still at its early stages. Can we really have a model of Islamic economic development? But together, they are, perhaps chartering a way for a future society, increases in human well-being and health and wealth, etc. Because I think it's very clear when you look at the constitutions in many states, in Muslim majority populations, it isn't a case of whether Islam should be part of the story. It's when and how. And the Islamic constitutions are very clear that there will be some sort of reference to Islamic Sharia if we look at all the various constitutions, Jordan, Oman, Bahrain, etc. So I do think we can adopt Islamic feminism as radical, and that it can further support the collective social movements. And a lovely review recently, I think it resonates with this whole paper. If people use faith, then let us use faith to drive towards social and political change. It went on to say Islamic feminism transcends revolutionary and nationalist ideology and consciously embrace or has embraced modernity, pluralism and human rights, while also cherishing faith and spirituality. And I do think this is definitely very post-colonial in its approach. It's very much within that realm, and all about presence, identity, recognition. Last slide, sorry. Thinking about the transnational feminist networks and the fact that Islamic feminism is often associated with distinct geographic regions, we need to sort of probably look at that, destabilise it, because transnationalism is doing away with border territories and is looking at the ebb and flow of knowledge. And I hope that we can get the global north and the global south communicating in a, what did Fatima Nissi say? She says, in a digital galaxy. I love that phrase, but anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me just introduce and start from my side. Sorry for that timer. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Asli Karaka from Central European University. She's a PhD candidate in comparative politics in Budapest. Her dissertation, Women's Islamic Movements and Politico-Religious Empowerment, Accommodation, Dissent, and Transgression in Turkey and Egypt, 1995 to 2016, is to be defended next month. We can congratulate her on submitting it and wish her good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beth, for the introduction and the good wishes. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Beirut, and I'm very excited to speak in front of this audience, like with most people here, I'm sure is very knowledgeable about the region. And because generally I presented mostly in Europe, mostly in Europe I think I presented. So I'm very excited to be here with the very experienced scholars of the region, and I'm looking forward for the comments and the discussion afterwards. Maybe I will do also a bit like talk back also to Connie's presentation, because I have some also additions or reflections on that. So the topic is what I deal with: women's political religious dissent and transgression in Turkey and Egypt. I will try to be fast in the first part because we have limited time. So what was my problem? What I see the problem in the context of the region is that religious traditionalism and extremism on the one hand, and post-colonial or non-colonial authoritarian regimes on the other hand, have curtailed political religious power of women in the MENA. And what I mean by political religious power is that it includes two aspects, interrelated aspects. First of all, it's women's access to the public sphere and decision-making mechanisms. Second, it's women's right to interpret and represent religion, especially when the religion is a denominator for social practices or legal rights. And more specifically in the region, these two aspects relate to mobilize or lobby to reform patriarchal religious family laws, as well as discriminatory secular laws. Second, promote gender equality in religion. And third, generate and respond to public debates on women's position in the society. So overall, in the region, I think women's political religious empowerment has been at stake for a long time, and it still is. And there is an optimistic literature on Islamic feminism, and Connie also mentioned quite rightly some of that. And there are also new studies on sexuality and Islam, which I think very important recent studies. I will have a critique to the optimistic literature of Islamic feminism. Basically, my main point today will be, I think, that about Islamic feminism, my main point will be, yes, we have very important work, theoretical work done, rereading Quran, also rethinking about the fiqh regulations, very important theoretical work, but it's as long as it stays in the theoretical part. Okay, there was some connections, as Connie mentioned, like family laws, but we know also that like the authoritarian state was also influential. For example, in Egypt, in Kul reform, Susan Mubarak's influence was still important, even though there was a women's movement behind the PSL, behind the Kul reform. There was a women's movement behind it, but still the final push came from Susan Mubarak, and it's still now in danger. Like people are discussing whether Kul is still religious or not in Egypt. So it's still a process of contestation. So in that sense, Islamic feminism cannot bring alone theoretically a change, but it has to be coupled with, first of all, broader activism movements, connection to the women's movements in the ground, and also a critique of political system. Because what I observed in some of the regions, some of the people in Turkey and Egypt, is that there are many academic Islamic feminists, but they stay in the academia and they do work on the religious texts, but they don't necessarily talk about, for example, political oppression. And I argue that it has to be able to, if we talk about the transformation of the whole thing, we need to have like actors saying also a word about political oppression. So yes, Islamic feminism can be one element, but it has to go together with the critique of the whole system as well. And I will discuss some people, especially the younger generation, who try to do both. Maybe I try to come to that. And yes, and related to this, I think, again, as a discussion, so yes, Islamic feminism can be radical in content, discussing taboo issues, definitely, but also the style, basically the movement element has to be, in a way, has to be there to make it radical, because if it only stays in the paper, the content is not that radical, but when you speak it out loud publicly, then it may become more radical. So in that sense, I think we need a more meso-organizational perspective on the so-called women's Islamic movements, and I define this a bit broader. I use also women who use religious discourse, I put in this definition. This is my own definition, but we can discuss. So my starting point, one of the first one, is that Abu Lughod's famous article is that resistance is power, and in this sense I argue that dissent of women, public dissent and visible dissent of women and visible transgressions of women are also clues of empowerment. And Linda Woodhead has a typology of relationship between religion and gender that I use. By the way, can you warm me in half and a half of my presentation? So according to her, a religion, or we can think about it as a also religious group or a discourse, it can be situated as mainstream to the existing gender order, or it can be situated as marginal to it. While the mainstream religion is integral to the gender order in a society, marginal religion or a religious group, let's say Islamic feminism, is regarded deviant by those who accept the existing gender order. And after the position, we have also the strategy of the group. The strategy can be also can confirm or sacralize the existing gender order, such as basically confirmatory, or it can challenge and resist it. Woodhead expresses the intersection of these two relations in a four-quadrant diagram. Basically, we have the mainstream and marginal position, and we can have the confirmatory and challenging positions. I connect her concepts to the political theorist Flavia Moncheri's discussion about the difference between dissent and transgression. Basically, she argues that whereas dissent is more kind of a resistance which aims to be recognized by the part of the dominant order, transgression is the result of an individual exercise of the power to construct rules and establish them as norms, a power having no need to be recognized by those who conform in order to be legitimated. In other words, transgression is a way to establish a new order within the old one, at the same time engendering at the cultural, social, and political level more or less lurking fears of disorder, anarchy, and self-destruction. So here, I connect the differentiation between dissent and transgression in the earlier theoretical framework. Basically, what I see is that both dissenting and transgressing women are among the challenging ones. So they are both, in terms of strategy, challenging the existing religious norms, but the dissenting ones are still staying within the framework. So they are dissenting from the religion, but they are still staying within certain boundaries. But the transgressors are both challenging and they stay marginal with their activities. So this is some details about my data collection, but this is perhaps not important now here. So I now have I will give you some snapshots and we can discuss further these implications. So some transgressions in Turkey, what I see as what I interpret as transgression or dissent. First of all, we have to mention here Islamic feminist Connie Christensen, who was killed in 1999 because of her public dissent or transgressions from the existing religious norms. She was a very bold public speaker, and she was going to the TV shows, and she was an ex-member of Turkish Hizbullah before, but then she quitted it and she joined feminist platforms, and she was using her headscarf herself, and some of the, for example, feminist women in her organization left the organization because she used the headscarf, because we had this, as you know, headscarf problem in Turkey. But she stayed and some women supported her. So she was she was active in supporting, for example, women's shelters in Mersin, in the town in Turkey. And basically she criticized the male-dominated interpretation of Quran. And after her last TV interview, where she said Adam and Eve was not descended okay, sorry. Okay, she had a comment about Adam, the meaning of Adam and Eve, basically, and having a second interpretation on it. And basically, after that, she was kidnapped, and after 9 months of captivity, she was killed. She was the first woman who was killed from the Islamic feminists in Turkey. And why do I mention this example? Because she had examples before herself. There were several secular men and women who talked about similar issues, but from a secular point of view, as Islamic scholars. For example, Bahriye Uçok, she was also killed in 9 years before her, and she was basically dissenting from within. For example, Bahriye Uçok was also a very important figure, and her ideas are very valuable. But she was talking as a person who is believing the secular system, and she was praising Kemal Atatürk's reform and everything, so everyone knows that she is speaking from without. But Kurish was speaking from within, but she took the risk despite the threats, and she was killed. This is one of the risks that take. So now I jump to the younger generation, because we had the headscarf bans in Turkey, which preoccupied basically women's Islamic movements in Turkey. They had to be preoccupied with the right to gain access to the parliament and education and everything. And what I argue is that basically this ban lagged them behind from engaging with other kinds of injustices that women face, especially within religion. But since 2008, we have a relaxation of bans in Turkey, and this enabled especially the young generation to deal more with the religious discourse. For example, oh my God, okay. For example, this is we have several platforms. One of them is called Muslims Against Violence Against Women, and they do the stickers. For example, it says in the stickers, the first one, Alhamdulillah, I'm against violence against women. The Prophet never hit any women, what about you? I take refuge in being silent in case of harassment, rape, and violence. Don't find excuse for harassment, take your eye away from haram. And they have also feminist, simply feminist slogans, don't turn a blind eye to harassment and rape. I quickly go to the blog. They have another group, young group has a blog, and they have some kind of so-called transgressive takes, because what defines transgression is kind of the result what you have, because first women think they don't do something transgressive, but then after the reactions. Another theologian woman wrote, "Was Adam a man?" criticizing that, thinking that he just represents a prototype of a human being. Adam is not necessarily representing a male. Was attacked a lot in the blog and criticized, and some were receiving threats. And basically, we can call this as a transgression because of the criticism and risks they had. And another one, "You Are Great, My Man," one of the founders of the initiative. She's a poet, and she's openly defines herself as a religious woman and Muslim woman. And she wrote poems about the Islamist man who treats her Islamist woman badly and in sexual tones, as you can see here in the poem. For example, there's the reflections on the sexual intercourse here, to criticize the system. "Turn my mouth into a garbage bin like a cheap tobacco, drag your pride that makes everything stink like a carcass, then bone the women as much as you could. I'm either the mother of Ummah or nobody, or the angel of mistakes or nobody. Make me believe in the deity of your sex, send me towards the obedience unconditionally, then in the prostitution of Mary and witchery of Adolphina." This is one example, and this also had a lot of criticism, and people questioned her religion, whether you are a religious person, you write about these things this way. And these two groups, by the way, have been also involved in the political contestation. They organized several protests during the Gezi protests. So that's also a very critical element, I think, that they don't only talk about women's rights within Islam, but also women's rights in general in the country, and also the political oppression in the country when it happens. Quickly to Egypt, if I have a few minutes. As I said, when I look at the self-identified Islamic feminists in Egypt, they are mostly academic. They have most academic background, and they introduce very important theoretical framework. But we see, especially now in the young generation, especially after the revolution or before the also revolution, there were some groups. But we see that dealing with sexuality and taboo issues with a religious language increase in publicly. For example, Nazra for Feminist Studies, this was founded in 2006, and there's a new, Nazra is a feminist organization, but it has some Islamic feminist members, such as Fatma Imam, that I will talk about. There's another platform now called Ikhtiyar. They also do they deal with taboo issues and sexuality issues. Again, Fatma Imam, one of the members. And in one of the Women and Memory Forum conferences, Women and Memory Forum, as you may know, documents the Egyptian women's history, a very important platform. When in a conference they organized, Fatma Imam and Yara Salam, two political activists, they presented a paper about the status of marital rape in Islam, which is a taboo issue and which is still not criminalized in many countries in the region. And they defended that according to Islam it should be criminalized, marital rape. So they used religious language, religious arguments dealing with the fiqh, saying that marital rape is a rape and should be criminalized. And why these two names, for example, are important? I mean, Yara Salam doesn't define herself as an Islamic feminist, she defines herself as an Arab African feminist, but Fatma Imam does define herself as Islamic feminist. These women are both courageous to be visible. Basically, visibility is very important, visible in public, in TV, conferences, out in the street. But especially to be visible to a broader audience is very important here. They both talk about sexuality and Islam, which can cause trouble to people, including risk of ostracization, losing jobs, persecution, prison. Yara Salam was in prison for her political activism. So they take a risk and they make themselves vulnerable. And this is, I think, this we may need for transformation. Unfortunately, we should question why, Shirin Rai had asked once, we should contextualize who is the risk-taking women, why. We should look at the networks. And what I see in terms of networks, I also would like to mention some examples. Another example, Azza Suleiman from Egypt, she's also working a lot in the family law. family law. And I want to also mention Mona El-Tahawi, although she's a very controversial figure, but she's also using an Islamic language to define sexuality. This is a question, Busi monologues. They are basically theater group, not theater but storytelling group, but they tell very taboo stories, including incest and rape in Arabic, in theater platforms, but the storytellers are anonymous here. So their visibility is kind of more limited in that sense. I mean, they have a public visibility as a group, as Busi monologues, but for the storyteller doesn't say it's my story because probably it's not her or we don't know. So in that sense, they don't risk their own reputation that much compared to, for example, people who speak up about their own ideas, who speak their own ideas about sexuality and taboo issues. These are some questions that we may think about: how much important is to be visible in public, and what are the networks? Just find out why maybe some women are more visible. What I can see is that feminist network around them is very important, kind of a platform, such as in Egypt, I would say Nazra, Ihtiyar, Women and Memory Forum have been platforms for some of these women to seek refuge and psychological also help in that manner. And sometimes international support, Azza Suleyman and Mona El-Tahawi is supported very much internationally. Sometimes international support is needed to speak more courageously. Perhaps we should think about it. And also local connections. Azza Suleyman had local connections to her, to the Bulaq region in Egypt, although now she's in a very difficult position because of her political stance. So it's a question how much also locality can protect people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Connie Christensen. Connie Christensen is a PhD, is Associate Professor in Gender Studies at Lebanese American University here in Beirut, where she manages a Carnegie-funded collaborative research project, Gender Equality in Islamic Family Laws, a transnational approach.
Thank you very much for this introduction. What I'm going to do in the following is to present the project that you just mentioned. I want to lead attention to the fact that we just started this project called Reforming Islamic Family Laws, a Transnational Movement Approach. So I think we are very much working within the framework of the two previous presentations, perhaps also trying to be a little bit more concrete in our approach. The project is placed in the Institute of Women's Studies in the Arab World at Lebanese American University. It's a collaborative research project which is also going to work with policy strategies. It's divided into 3 phases. I'm going to go through this very quickly. The first phase is going to be an analysis of transnational social movements that are working for the reform of Islamic family laws within national contexts. A second phase is going to analyze the potential for reform in particular national contexts within the Middle East. And then the phase 3 is going to be concerned with the policy strategies. And we're going to be working with key legal figures from particular national contexts too. And the 3 case studies that we will be working with is Morocco, Egypt, and Lebanon. I'm not going to work on this project all by myself. So we have a research collaborator from Morocco, one from Egypt, and one from Lebanon. Our research question is, considering the fact that transnational social movements increasingly influence also Arab states, we want to ask how transnational activism for the reform of Islamic family laws within an Islamic framework may impinge on the processes of reform in Arab states. The background for the project, like I said, relates very much to the two previous presentations. At least I see the background as one of Islamic feminism emerging within the recent decades. Women activists who in networks and organizations work in order to identify and bring forward egalitarian voices from Islamic scriptures, from the Quran, relevant for women's equal legal and religious status. Now, I think this work has often been associated with life as a Muslim woman in Western or more secular states. And I think one of the aims of this project is to demonstrate that this is not necessarily the case, that this work is also part of the women's movements and women's intellectual work currently within the Middle East. And we're going to apply Islamic feminism as a term, despite current, I would say, still reluctance among some Muslim women working within this field to accept and apply that notion. But I think it's important because we need to be able to identify convergences with a more international, transnational feminism. Now, Beirut has a few years back defined Islamic feminism as a discourse and practice articulated within an Islamic paradigm, and it derives its understanding and mandate from the Quran. I think this is perhaps a good definition as a start. It's a little bit broad, it's not very concrete. So I think that it is actually possible to make this definition more concrete by bringing in some of these pioneers that have also been mentioned by previous speakers. I want to highlight Fatima Manisi of Morocco, Leila Ahmed, and Amina Wadoud as three of these researchers and intellectuals who have been investigating this egalitarian voice and feminist potential in Islam. In contrast, I would say, to previous feminist organizations, for instance, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which is a solidarity network, assuming that the problem usually is Islamic laws themselves and not, or is Islam and the ideas and the positions that an Islamic faith brings along. Now, women scholar activists have been suggested as how we should designate these women, trying to capture that they are intellectual, they are reform-oriented, and maybe also, we can discuss that, elitist. I want, however, also to mention Ziba Mir Hosseini, who calls herself a legal anthropologist. She's also a researcher, a filmmaker, and a co-founder of the organization Musawa, meaning equality, which calls itself a global organization. According to Mir Hosseini, there are three moments that are very important for the onset of this investigation of the egalitarian and feminist potential of Islam. The codification of Islamic family laws followed the independence of Arab states after World War II, and during that process women were absent. They were simply not part of that process. The other moment that she highlights is the rise of political Islam, which at the same time was a reversal of the one-directional march towards secularization within the Middle East. And the 80s and the 90s, maybe even the 1970s, should also be included as the time period when this actually took place. A third phase is then a phase of Muslim reform thinkers responding to the Islamist challenge, asking what are the rights of Muslim women in the Muslim legal tradition, and then again trying to recapture this egalitarian voice. On the other hand, we have transnational feminist networks, as I think Valentin Bogadam calls them, or transnational feminist social movements, taking inspiration from Al-Ali and Pratt. I think it's important to designate this movement as not just the practices that connect women cross-nationally, but to also include a kind of analysis within those practices, analysis of how gendered hierarchies intersect with post-colonial structures of race, culture, and ethnicities. And we have already had Mina Sharif-Funk, who in her book Encountering the Transnational Women, Islam and the Politics of Interpretation, the book is from 2008, perhaps optimistically, has pointed out to the formation of vibrant transnational networks among Muslim women from diverse geographical locales and worldviews as a sign that there are new patterns of conversation emerging. I hope she's right. One very concrete way to try to find out whether she's right or not could be to look at the current organizations and networks in fact existing. And I think one which is dominant is the organization called Musawa that I mentioned previously, an organization working for equality in the Muslim family. The initiative was taken by a Malaysian organization called Sisters in Islam, and it was operating in Malaysia already in the 1970s. Musawa was officially initiated in 2009 with a huge meeting with, I think, more than 50 countries represented. And Musawa today has as its major activities capacity building of women activists, advocacy, however, on an international and regional and not on a national level. They give comments for the review of the CEDAW and human rights generally. They have resources and tools on their website, and knowledge building is a core strategy of Musawa. Now, if we look at the strategy of transnational networks more generally, here it's taken from the framework of development policies, Yiannakopoulos has proposed that there are three major strategies applied. The first one she's calling scaling up, for which ICTs are important. Local or national organizations link to the regional and the international level, and in order to do that they need specialist skills. Another strategy is campaigning and lobbying, which is needed, of course, in order for the organization to create leverage to have their message transferred to audiences. And finally, bridging, which is a strategy which combines lobbying and advocacy, but also trying to connect with local or national contexts in order to preserve or reinforce the legitimacy of their ventures. Now, for Musawa, like I said, the emphasis is on knowledge building, close collaboration between scholars and activists, but local anchorage is not their priority. This I left more to individual researchers and also to the group of ambassadors that Musawa have appointed, ambassadors that are, of course, more localized than the organization itself is. So here's the website of Musawa. Knowledge building stands out as one of their priorities, and at the core of Musawa is the reinterpretation of core concepts of Muslim family laws, since in the eyes of Musawa, these concepts constitute the DNA of patriarchy in Muslim legal tradition. As an example, I'll give you the concept of kiwama, which is actually not the form of the concept within the Quran, where it's actually called kawawum, meaning the protectors and the maintainers, and not as classical Islamic jurists have interpreted the term as a universal male authority over women. Now, there have been many consequences of this sliding from one understanding to another, if you ask again Musawa, because it has consequences for how marriage and divorce have been constituted in Islamic family laws, but further consequences for women's stance in terms of polygamy, inheritance, repudiation, and political office. So this kind of sliding is, in the eyes of Musawa, in fact, at the core and a very central part of understanding what might come out of another reading of the Quran. So the aim of the collaborative project that we have just initiated is to try to localize the reform potential that you find within organizations like Musawa. Now, Musawa will not be the only organization that we're going to focus upon, but this is to give you just an illustration. Transnational framework fosters primarily cross-national and cross-regional convergences, but of course Islamic family laws are local and national, so there needs to be a better linkage between what is happening in organizations like Musawa at a global or transnational level, and then to localize it to national context. And hopefully this project is going to accomplish at least some of that. Thank you very much.
So the floor is open for questions now. If you could identify yourself when asking the question, and we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll answer them. So we'll start here and then we'll go there.
Okay, Doris Gray, Al Akhawain University in Morocco. I have more of two comments than a question. One, just to preface, you know that Musawa was denied moving their headquarters to Morocco. They were trying to move their headquarters to Morocco and were not successful in doing that. So Islamic feminism is very much a state tool. And when it conforms to the state project, it's accepted. When it doesn't conform to the state project, it's not accepted. Reference to religion when changing the family code may just be one reference point. Some people would argue that the Moroccan family law was reformed by secularizing it, not by having more reference or new interpretation of Islam, but by actually taking it more under state control. So I think when you're talking about changing family law, there is a two-pronged approach. One is the reference to religion, and one is a more secularizing project. And the other thing that I find important is I teach Islamic feminism in Morocco. And one point my students always bring up is why, as people from Muslim majority countries, is our only choice for feminists Islamic feminists? Why can we not be secular or atheist feminists? So I think it's very important when we talk about pluralism that that pluralism doesn't then just refer to religious pluralism, but also people to have the choice to be non-religious activists for gender equality.
Well, right now it's up here.
Sari Hanafi. This question for the whole panel. I would understand perfectly what would be an Islamic feminism as an activism. You have a communist feminism, you have a leftist, you have, but when it comes to knowledge production, here where I'm reluctant to accept it as a label, not as a content. Actually, many of the content, Beverly, for instance, what you hint into, to take into account the faith, the emotion of people, etc. This make absolutely sense. We social scientists that we should acknowledge more a tradition of people, how they think, their world system, including something some would consider non-rational, while we should accept it as it is. But myself, I work a lot on Islamization of social science. Okay, so I wrote about it, and I showed that this led nowhere. Neither empirically, you don't see really production that really we say, wow, this is different from what is social science in general, nor epistemologically, because they kept into this kind of dichotomous, antagonistic concepts. For instance, collectivist we are, and the liberalists are individualist, etc. But I mean, what about liberal multiculturalists? I mean, are they? Should we label? I mean, again, I see with this trend a kind of a reverse mirror of the excess of post-colonialism, which create this antagonistic concepts. I mean, West, East, tradition, modernity, etc. And I'm expecting this. I will stop here. That scholar to critically look to this scholarship and to see whether this label has meaning or just it's an extension of an activism.
Why don't we just take one last question, then we'll back there.
Hi, thank you very much, Nadim. I'm just a graduate student here. I just have a question for Beverly. and building on what Professor Hanafi had just said, I just felt like this is like a kind of a repeat of Salah Mahmoud's kind of argument, and not to say anything about that, but no, didn't it place too much emphasis on agency, right? Because it's saying, however you define yourself as, whatever you say, basically, is considered valid, we should respect it, and so on. And I'm not saying it's problematic, but it is kind of problematic in the sense that if one seriously wants to take agency, seriously, sorry for repeating that, shouldn't one attend very carefully to the institutional structures which create certain desires, and therefore the subject that you assume is very unified and very clear and transparent. But we all know about how desires work, internalization of certain paradigms, the way subjects are fragmented and not so. Just because someone desires something or doesn't want it, or whatever they say, it doesn't mean it's good or it's good for even them, and so on. So I just want to maybe problematize the assumption of the subject that was given, which is like a clear, transparent subject who knows what they want and knows what's emancipatory and what's not, and therefore whatever they say is valid. Whereas I think if one wants to truly respect agency, one must seriously attend to the institutional and structural framework to see to what extent those desires are very much a result or an extension, once again, of the context in which one is in. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let the speakers respond, and then we'll take another round.
Do you want to start? Okay.
Yeah, I do think that the label of any feminism is problematic. I said we should distinguish, if we can call it a movement, within the global post-feminist debates that are going on. And basically, there is a lot of people saying, well, we don't need feminism, we don't need it as a label. Let's just do things in terms of promoting human equality. It's like there's some scariness associated with the feminist label. Globally, feminism is seen as, it is undermining, the political institutional structures, and it still doesn't have, legitimacy in many domains, whether it's in economic policy or social policy. So I think the Islamic feminism, in naming it Islamic feminism, are we stifling it? Are we putting it, within a framework that is going to be tainting it? And the idea of agency, I can't remember who said it about agency. And I don't think you can, the whole idea is you don't universalise agency. And I think agencies are problematic in any social movement or any activist movement, because are you doing it from within your own repertoire of diverse signifiers that is constituting what you do and how you do it? And, I go back again, the being and doing of feminism, any feminism, is really hard. But I don't think we can say there's one agency. I think it's very fluid and it's very, very multiple. And part of the debate is thinking about what it could potentially do and then lead on to action. And the idea of choosing the feminine signifier deliberately is trying to destabilise the texts that give privileging to men and masculinities. But that's very much focusing on post-structuralists, and I would also think that they would call themselves post-colonialists, who are trying to misconnect their thinking from the global male narratives of many global philosophies. Anyway, I could go on all about that post-structuralism identity, so I'll hand it on.
Thank you. I want to reply to Doreen Gray first, and I want to take advantage of our project having not yet concluded because we are not certain that the potential of Musawa and other organizations at the work that they're doing is equal in each country, and maybe that potential is very little currently in Morocco. I think we selected 3 countries that are very different between them, Morocco, Egypt and Lebanon, and I don't think that there is any guarantee that there is a vast potential in each of these countries. Of course, we think that there is some potential somewhere, but otherwise we wouldn't engage with this project. But I'm also aware that there may be other versions and other strategies that may apply better in certain situations. Regarding Islamization of sciences, a very interesting topic, I would say, but I think in this case that is not what is actually happening. I would say rather perhaps the reverse, that modern techniques of interpretation are applied on Islamic scriptures. So I don't think that this Islamic feminism is actually a proponent for Islamization of science as such. I don't see it that way, at least. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think Dorian also asked, as for all of us, as far as I understand. I definitely agree that I think we shouldn't, because this panel was all about the political religious issues and Islam feminism. That's why we focused on the dissent within. But I definitely I think we should also count blasphemous speech as part of the women's political religious empowerment. If a woman says, "I don't believe in God," whatever, this should be also part of it, definitely. Here it's just because of the topic is within, so I talked on my account. I look at the within critique or within transgressions. I look, and but also in Egypt, for example, Azza Suleiman from she is both in Musawa and in Sevla. She was working also a unified family law for both Christians and Muslims in Egypt, and she was thinking it's possible to have a civil law in Egypt, for example. So I think same people who are trying to use a religious reformist language, sometimes strategically, of course, they are also trying, at the same time, they are also working for actually secularizing it. So actually they are not necessarily different actors, very interestingly. But I think still this topic, I don't say unfortunately, like I'm not a religious person myself, but we know that religion is an extra additional power. Woodhead also argues that it's as gender relations include power, religion adds an extra relation of power, and often at the expense of women and other minorities. So we know this, that religion makes people's life more difficult, women's life. And for example, in Turkey, what we see, we have the secular family law, which is good, and it was easier to reform the sexist language in the secular reform because it's secular. Women didn't have to talk to the Islamic preachers, Islamic reformers. They didn't have to go there. It was much easier for women to reform. But now we are seeing an incremental approach to Islamization of the legal discourse in Turkey, unfortunately. And this is a reality, and some women are engaging with it, and we may unfortunately need this. I mean, of course, as a believer, if someone's a believer, of course, this is good. But strategically speaking, this is the situation.
And so we'll take another round of questions now. Over here. Oh, yeah. Okay. First, start here.
Hello, my name is Opa Ali, and I am an AUB student. So my question is for all of you. This is my first time in this country, and it's also my first Arab country that I have been to. So I just want to ask you, do you guys, because coming to here, I have seen a lot of domestic workers, and those domestic workers, they don't have their own basic rights. Forget about, competing with men or whatever, but basically people in here, they also discriminated because where they are coming from, or like how they look or their color. So as a feminist, and also as like women, what are like your missions in the future that you guys can make sure that all women, despite where they are coming from or their color, how can you motivate them that they can have the same mission? Because for me, if I go outside, I know that people will take advantage of me in this country, and I don't feel comfortable, to be honest. So what are your advices for those girls who have a different color, who have maybe a different background, and how can you also motivate the Arab nations to also know, so they can know that those girls also do have the same rights and same missions that they are looking for? Thank you.
Thank you for your
Hello, my name is Shafran. I'm an AUB student. I have two things. So first, Dr. Beverly, you talked about feminizing the social change and reforming to contribute to gender equality. But don't you think that when we talk about feminizing the social change, it may make it, or it may insinuate the segregation or the oppression of the role of men in the feminist movement? Secondly, concerning the Islam and feminism, we know that both terms or both movements are sort of sensitive all over the world, not just in the Arab world. Islam as a religion, when we talk about religious issues, it becomes a very sensitive topic, and we talk about women's rights and feminism is also a sensitive topic. So combining these things together and forming the Islamic movement, don't you think that it may sort of increase the hostility towards the movement for religion and the movement towards women's rights? But also, what about the role of the going back to Uba's question, the role of minorities in the Arab region in contributing to the Islamic feminist movement? Because when the minorities, maybe let's say Africans or people of color, live in the Arab region, they are segregated, they face more issues such as racism. So how can they move from that group and then be able to also contribute to Islamic feminism? Thank you.
Maybe I have more of a comment than a question, but because we're talking about Islamic feminism, I mean, in other monotheistic faiths like Christianity and Judaism, we also have feminisms. We also have Christians who are Christian feminists and Jewish who are Jewish feminists. So this is not something which is specific to Islam. To want to sort of remain within your faith, realize that there is some gender inequality within your religious discourse, and then wanting to remain within that faith, find ways to come up with a challenging or a contesting discourse to, what is generally said. And among some of the Muslim feminists, like for example, Islamic feminists like Aisha Hidayatullah, for example, who works in the States, I mean, some of the problems that these feminists eventually face is epistemologically what happens when you face in a sacred text, like the Quran, for example, something which, no matter how you turn it or you interpret it, or in the Bible, or in the Hebrew Bible, cannot be, in a sense, reinterpreted to be understood as something which is for women. So this is one, for example, like hitting the woman, etc. And this is something that the Muslim feminists themselves raise. What do we do? I mean, what do we do when we are in front of the face? Like Sia Ali, for example, also talks about that. When I face a verse that no matter how I turn it, I cannot think of it differently. But other than, this, maybe eventually they will have to come up with answers, but I think it is a very important process for women who do want to remain within their faith to find a way to challenge from within. I mean, it shouldn't be the only one, right? Other people who think differently, like you have mentioned, should be also granted the possibility to contest from outside the religious framework. But I think it's also very important to allow women who want to do that, to do so. Voilà. That's all.
Let me take one more comment back here, and then we'll take some answers or common question.
My name is Hissan Aboud. I would have loved to see any of Arab scholars here among you who would speak about Islamic feminism in Egypt and what's going on in Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco, because there are many important activities going there, scholarly and activism. I will mention some name, of course, Umayma Abu Bakr, Amani Saleh in Egypt, and many others. Even we would say Aisha Abdul Rahman. Before that, she did some work, even if she were not a typical feminist. Also in Tunisia, very important work by Selini on inheritance, by Ulfat Yusuf in Morocco. Also from Fatima Manisi did not use the name Islamic feminism, but she contributed a lot in the Moroccan discourse. And now the Center of Women Studies of Women in Islam in Dr. Asma al-Mrabit and all the good work that's coming from there. And I see that in Morocco there's something interesting going on, that the religious discourse is admitting that the secular discourse they are indebted to the secular discourse. They are not in Sidam, they are not at all in conflict. They are saying that we owe, as Madam Rabit says, we owe a lot to the secular discourse in our work. So starting from Fatima Manis, who did a lot of work even before the name was being mentioned, and ending now with the state and the activism that we see it there, and it's very important, is that in the reform of the Mudawwint Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya and in Mudawwint al-Usra, and even changing the name of Qiwama, using the name that marriage is the responsibilities of the two spouses. I just want to mention that in AUB we had a seminar by Bahithat, Asfari and Women Center in Esqua, and we brought the Moroccan and Lebanese experiences together, and as far as legal and political gains, and the papers will be published online by Women Center in Esqua for the Moroccan and Lebanese. This is for the project at Awsaw and Awsaw and LAU at LAU. Thank you.
There are more questions. So do you want to answer briefly? You want to take more questions? It's fine. Take more questions.
No.
Yeah. We'll take some more questions, and then we'll give the panelists a chance to. So in the back, this one. You have to raise your hands high.
Sarah Al-Masri, I'm a researcher. So my question is for Dr. Beverly. I think during your presentation you had one of the slides, I think, mentioning the achievements of Islamic feminism. And I think this maybe was touched upon in some of the questions, but a lot of people, when reading this list, would actually attribute some of those achievements to secular feminists or even secular movements in some of the Arab countries. I'm more experienced with the Egyptian case. Khul'a law is mostly attributed to Suzanne Mubarak and state feminism in general, and I think also in the Moroccan case, you can attribute it to other groups. So I just wonder why you had this list under Islamist feminism. And I think the other question I have is for Asili, if I'm not pronouncing your name wrong, I'm sorry. So my question to you is actually also with regards to the choice of some of those Islamic feminist figures that you had. So a lot of people, and again, I'm from Egypt, so I see a lot of those activists I know of personally even, and they don't identify as Islamic feminists, as you may know. And I was just wondering, like, why you had those Nazra included in your pieces. What was your justification, theoretically speaking? That's it. Thank you.
So, yeah, last question right here, and then.
Yes. Fida Afshoni, School of Business. I have a technical question, Beverly, about you talk about feminizing Islam and fiqh and jurisprudence. So how exactly do we do that? And have anybody succeeded in doing that? And I think I'm not an expert in Islam and the governance, but if you compare it to other religions, it's not something that's centralized. For example, in Christianity, you have a pope. If there's a change, it's there, and everybody applies it, and it's sustainable. So my question is about the sustainability of Islamic jurisprudence, because it's very hard to sustain. Another imam can come and reverse the jurisprudence. So technically on the ground, how can we feminize Islam, and how can we make sure that this feminization, if it happens, is sustainable?
Okay, little note and then we'll.
I was hesitant to say this little note, but it keeps coming always, and it does really does not sit well with me when we speak about gender. The use of MENA. MENA is a colonial term. It's not elaborating. MENA, Middle East, to who? To Britain, to the colonial system. So we are West Asia. We are not MENA. We are West Asia and North Africa. So seeing MENA appearing in gender work is just, as I said, a little note, but it's improper from my perspective.
Okay, there's one last question right there.
Hi, Ginger Feather from University of Kansas. And when we start talking about Islamic feminism versus secular feminism, I think we're falling kind of prey to this same dichotomization of gendering. My work uses the ACF framework, which is problematizes this dichotomy and goes into, through interviews with women's organizations, Islamic and secular, throughout Morocco and Tunisia, what are their core beliefs? How do they identify themselves? But then, more importantly, how do they approach social issues, each social issue? So I think if we can get out of our heads this identification of I'm either secular or I'm Islamic, like I have, even in my work, I have to differentiate Muslim feminists, progressive Muslim feminists, conservative Islamic feminists who are still feminists because they promote, or I'd say even perhaps anti-feminists, because they promote feminist causes in the public area, economic and social, but not in the private, not in the family. They maintain that complementarity. So, within Islamic feminists, I have 3 categories and probably could have 5. And I think we need to kind of, we're talking about a spectrum in other areas, in gender, and I think we need to kind of take that into how we look at gendering our work to try to bring in these other, not make the identity so concrete that we've homogenized. We've done what we, as feminists, gripe about. We're homogenizing whole categories of people by saying they're, you're Islamic feminist or you're secular. It's the same that the black feminists would argue with intersectionality. If we say we want equality between men and women, well, we've just homogenized. We're doing, we're digging our own graves by saying, all men subscribe to patriarchy. So I think we need to problematize some of the language we use and, how we approach different organizations, how we coalition build, and this to Dr. Beverly for the Moroccan project and others, just try to get past that dichotomy, because I don't think it's useful for us, and I think it kind of even limits the way we're able to build our coalitions. Thank you.
So thank you for all those wonderful questions. So we'll just let each of the speakers comment.
Thank you for the questions, very rich. I want to start with the first Oba question. Very important, I think, this issue of other oppressions we face because of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. That's very important. actually some of the, for example, in US, some of the African American women were involved a lot in Islamic feminism, like main examples Amina Wadud, and then we had Zohara Simmons. So I think also in Egypt I mentioned Fatma Imam, and maybe I didn't have time to mention, but she's of Nubian origin and she writes texts about her Nubian origin in Egypt and how she is discriminated in Egypt and how she hears every day on the street sexist and racist comments. And what I think that having to face this kind of oppressions probably creates a sensitivity in these actors, and so they start to question what it for these believer women, because they describe themselves as such. They start to question, is it so in the religion? So she described to me like this is one way, also her way to approach to Islamic feminism, like to ask questions. So I think there is a lot of relation between different type of oppression and how it makes you sensitized to work for more equality. Also in Turkey, the groups I mentioned, they are mostly coming from Islamist leftist background, and they are actually in the street for workers' rights all the time. I mean, they were more in the past because now it's more dangerous to protest outside, but they are also active in the workers' rights movements. So, but this is of course not necessarily limited to Islamic movements. For all movements, I think different layers of oppression creates in the activists more awareness of the rights of others. So that's a very important point you mentioned. Yeah, but of course I'm not an activist. I cannot perhaps you said I think can you give some suggestions for people if I understood well, but I can show the examples. These are the examples, and I think it's important. And another important question to me, why did I include Nazra? Actually, I did not, so my presentation was not specifically on Islamic feminism. It's Islamic feminism, I have to talk about it because the actors are talk about it. I look at political religious empowerment and political religious discourse, and as I mentioned, in my definition of women's Islamic movements, I don't only look at people who self-identify themselves as Islamic feminists or self-identify themselves as religious, but I also include women who use religious discourse like Azza Suleyman. I put Yara Sallam, but I mentioned she defines herself as African feminist, not Islamic feminist, but she contributed to an Islamic feminist discourse. So I think in my personal account, I only use Islamic feminist if they use it is for them as such, like I use self-identified Islamic feminists, but the work they do, if it's in line with the idea, I can use Islamic feminist, but I don't have a problem with the term. But Fatima Sadat also argues that it's a wrong term and we should use convergence of Islam and feminism. That's okay. We can also use that. I think the names are not that very important, and this also shows that the other question, there was a question about the secular and religious together is not a binary. That's definitely we are like, this my presentation was trying to show, people coming from secular backgrounds and religious backgrounds contribute to this discourse of political religious empowerment of women, socially and legally, because it's relevant. And the names, I think we shouldn't stick to this name issue, I mean, too much, in my opinion. I think we should look at what the actors are doing in the ground. Maybe I give to other speakers, and then maybe if we have time I can.
Yes, I want to thank the audience for all these very valuable comments. I think most of them have been comments, and I have been actually writing extensive notes. I only want to say that I also think the issues raised by our two AUB students here is a very important one, and one that should also be addressed towards the networks that we in our project are going to work with. So this is actually why I was trying to propose transnational feminism as not only practice across borders, but also a method where you need to look at how power hierarchies are positioned and changing from one geographical context to another, but also how they inflict on what is happening within one national context. You mentioned Lebanon, and of course Lebanon is one of the national contexts that we're going to investigate. So I see this as a challenge in our project to these networks. Then I want to say also that I value these questions to our terminology. I think we need always to go back and constantly put into doubt the categories that we are operating with. We also know that we cannot perform any kind of science without those categories. So all the time we need to go back and forth between applying and questioning, applying and questioning. I fully agree with the questioning that has been raised in this room today. Thank you.
Thanks. Just a point of clarification. When you look at the slide, I'm not suggesting Fatima Mernissi started Islamic feminism. I'm only suggesting that she did a bit of rewriting of her text in 1975 and then in her text that came after in 1991. In terms of achievements, question mark. And when you look at the potential achievements, I'm very well aware about the call and the debate of Mubarak involvement in that. But again, if we're going to adopt transnationalism, how do we name something? How do we name resistance? Are labels really necessary? If you've got networks, you've got to have a to and fro of ideas. So whether that's black feminism or whether it's secular feminism or Latin American feminism, we've all got to get on because it's about struggle, it's about social change, it's about standing up and setting a new agenda. So in terms of who should we include and how do we name people, I think that's an ongoing project. One of the things I do think, I don't know how the field are going to manage this. It's in terms of looking at race and racialist concerns, and I can see it. But there are very much hierarchies in states in terms of your national origin. Some identities are more equal than others, and I've seen that as well, especially in Lebanon. And I'd love to hear from the audience about how we can incorporate black identity into feminism or into the broader debates in Islamic feminism. Right, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful panel. Will you join me in thanking our presenters and thanking the audience?
Oh, I forgot to mention about Hanafi and Malaki
and
Bali,
yes.
all the different,
Yes.
the Islamic jurisprudence, how do you do it?
Nice to meet you finally.
Yeah, you emailed me, didn't you, about